And now I'm going to turn it over to our Raleigh Organizing Against Racism co-chair, Mr. Melvin Jackson.
Hold on for a second. Let me see if I can get to the slide. Good morning, and I want to welcome you to this Juneteenth community meeting. I want to share with you the mission of the Raleigh Organizing Against Racism, and I would encourage you to be involved with us, especially through this process. Our mission is to dismantle systems of racial advantage and oppression through education, analysis, healing, community building, and institutional transformation. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Melvin. So I just want to remind everyone of our format for today's meeting. It is a webinar format. Participants are muted. You can use the chat box to submit questions to our moderators. Our moderators today are Cash Sharon and Betty Murchison. So if you have any questions that come up as you're listening to the presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat box to our moderators, and we will make sure to address those during the Q&A session. Also, if you have any technical difficulties or are having, technical difficulties throughout the presentation, you can ask the moderators as well to assist. So now, without further ado, I've been waiting for this all week, Dr. Johnson. I'm so excited. As a former 8th grade social studies teacher, as an African-American woman, I'm just really excited that you're here with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Miss Betty so that she can provide your formal introduction.
Thank you, Siobhan. I'm excited as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson. I won't read all of her bio, but I want you to know that she is the Dean of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities and Professor of Sociology at Shaw University in Raleigh. She is also co-director of Shaw's Center for Racial and Social Justice. Previously, she was the Mott Distinguished Professor of Women's Studies and Director of Africana Women's Studies at Bennett College in Greensboro, which is where I met her while my daughter Carmen was a student there, one of her students. She holds a PhD in medical anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and San Francisco. She has an MA in sociology from Atlanta University, now at Clark Atlanta, and a BA in sociology from Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Johnson has also completed doula training focused especially on women of color. Her research was conducted in Costa Rica, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, the Seychelles Islands, and the US, and is centered on gender, bioethics, disability, the health of women and girls, and environmental justice. In addition, she's published and given lectures in these research areas. She also does research and conduct talks on American foodways and nature spaces, and Black women's garden clubs is her focus. Now, she has other scholarly work that she's conducted. She also chairs the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. She serves on the North Carolina Historical Commission, the National Registry Advisory Committee, and she's a member of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters, the board, and the Board of Directors of Preservation North Carolina. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Johnson. She received probably 30 or 40 invitations to speak at other places on this day because she is a renowned speaker in all of those areas and more. But we feel very special to know that she chose us for this special occasion. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Betty, for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank Roar for the invitation, and I'm honored that you have selected me to talk to you a little bit today about Juneteenth. And so I want to get into PowerPoint presentation so that we have plenty of time to have question and answer and to be able to have a chat together. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me a minute to get to the slide presentation. And okay. And just to do a check, y'all can see the slide, right? It should say Juneteenth, our new federal holiday.
Yes, we can see that, Dr. Johnson. Yep.
Thank you, Siobhan. So I will explain who the couple are a little bit later in the slideshow. And I wanted to have a visual discussion about this Juneteenth. And it's interesting. I want to take a moment to reflect on the fact that it's now our 12th federal holiday. The last one that a bill was sent forward through was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day in January. That was in the 80s. So it's been a while. Need to move this over just a wee bit. Okay. As you can see, this day, usually, and we say usually on June 19th, some folks celebrate around that particular date, is when enslaved Africans in Texas found out that they were free from bondage. And people know kind of that general story. I think of it as a day for remembrance, celebration, and reflection. And as one of my colleagues, Dr. Corey Walker from Wake Forest says, it is a day for action. It's a time to, in fact, it's a call to action. And I'll explain that a little later. And it's noted as it's the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of enslavement. And one thing that we know is that folks were celebrating the end of enslavement starting from the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect January 1, 1863. But this one has taken on a national significance in large part, and this is something to remember, that this was a celebration that was organized, conceived of by Black folks, and that it followed in many ways the traverse of Black people across the country. But primarily, as African Americans moved, Black folks moved from Texas and Louisiana, they brought Juneteenth with them west. And so my first Juneteenth celebration was in California. And my favorite one was in Oakland, California. Oh, many, many years ago. We had a parade, we had dancing, we had discussions about what Juneteenth really meant to us. And it was also recognizing that connection that folks had back home. So it was several things going on at one time. Here is a photograph, and I love to show this photograph because of the dignity with which you see these African Americans, these Black folks. This is from the Austin History Center. And you see the discussion about in Galveston was where the declaration came. And I'm gonna read it because I think it's important to hear the words of the words that the people of Texas, the Black people of Texas heard. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. The connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. And this was considered General Orders number 3, proclaimed on June 19, 1865 in Galveston, Texas, by Major General Gordon Granger. Now, think about some of the last parts of those orders. They were not to be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Now, these are folks who just came out of enslavement. Don't think that this was an idle population, but these kinds of words, this kind of sentiment was part of the framing of this new population of freed folks. I don't think that it was a fair depiction, but it does help us understand some of the resistance that happened during that time. And it wasn't an easy walk. People didn't just stop working as enslaved persons and then pick up whatever trade they wanted to. This was contested. There were violent acts to prevent African people, these formerly enslaved persons, from leaving their areas and for asserting their freedom. Things that I find worth noting: after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, close to 200,000 Black men enlisted to fight. And this became the US colored troops. The US colored troops were the ones who helped carry the message of freedom throughout the former Confederate states. And you can think of it as a wave of messaging going up from east, southeast to west. The furthest most point would be Texas as a Confederate state. Even when Order number 3 had been issued, most of the 250,000 enslaved in Texas were not immediately freed. And those owners of the former enslaved determined when and how to announce the news, which is why the US colored troops, other federal troops had to carry the news, because they were keeping that proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, quiet. They also were not talking about the 13th Amendment, that was the law that undergirded that proclamation. This was all a very difficult time. And as we see later on, if we were to skip ahead into the Reconstruction era, we know that this was not taken very well by those who wanted to remain dominant over this group of people. I call attention to other places, other ways in which people were marking emancipation in an interesting way. So in Pinehurst, North Carolina, they'd have Old Slave Day reunions. So this is 1934. Part of it is to remember and to not forget that these are peoples who were formerly enslaved, and they were recognizing and honoring them. So here are two gentlemen, Reverend Thomas B. McCain on the left and Demas Taylor on the right. And can you imagine, Taylor was said to be more than 100 years old and was a well-known turpentine worker in Moore County. And turpentine was a big industry. And just look at them, that they were survivors, that they were able to come on the other side of that time of enslavement. I also think of this as a bittersweet celebration, bitter in the fact that many people lost their lives. There's a reflection from a formerly enslaved person that's captured in the Library of Congress, where she describes people being shot and killed as they were escaping over the into the Sabine River in Texas in order to assert their freedom. And not only were they killed by guns, revolvers, whatever, they were also lynched. So this was not, again, something that was easily asserted. Here's another formerly enslaved couple in 1890, and they are photographed. And this was the couple that I opened the program with. And at the bottom, it says that they were old-time wood sawyer from New Bern. And I just look at these photographs because they're some of the few ways in which we can remember people who were enslaved. And in New Bern, Emancipation Day was celebrated first on January 1, 1865. These are, it's a visual record. It is, again, it's not an eyewitness sketch, but it was an article about how former slaves were celebrating in 1863. And all of this is in conversation with Juneteenth, that as we talk about Juneteenth, we can't de-link it from what preceded it and what came after it. So here are some of the other dates that we can look to where folks remembered or celebrated or commemorated the end of enslavement. And these are all in the 1800s. So we know that in September 22nd, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation order. And we know how slow bills take to enact and all of the ways in which there's horse trading back and forth of what should be in the bill. It took effect on January 1, January 31, that is when the 13th Amendment passed Congress in 1865, but it wasn't ratified until December 6th. So I point this out because these are all, this is why this is an ambiguous time in our nation's history, that some folk knew that they were free, others would not know. And it was these different dates that lent itself to that kind of ambiguity. Other dates in 1865, the day Richmond fell was April 3rd. Lee surrenders April 9th. And then we go into 1862, that in the nation's capital, that was April 16th. So some people mark those days as the days when we can count as being free. Other days would be when May 1st, where the Union war dead were given a proper burial. And so we have that day. And then the contention around July 4th, as Siobhan mentioned earlier, that July 4th, America's Independence Day, was not all of America's Independence Day. So now that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, what happens next? I think there are things that we need to consider. We consider the fact that Juneteenth was a federal holiday that comes to us very quickly. Think of the time that it took through the Senate unanimously saying that Juneteenth is our holiday, passing a bill, unanimous. And I think about that because that thing just kind of rattled me a bit. And it rattled me for this reason. We can pass with the unanimous Senate a federal holiday, a day of commemoration, celebration, however you want to depict it. Also Freedom Day, but we are not able to have a Senate that can pass a Voting Rights Act unanimously, a Senate that is unable to pass other legislation to make us truly free. And I mean all of us in this nation, all of us in this country. How is it that we don't have a universal voting rights act? How is it that we have not reckoned with police reform, which to me is light. I mean, it's hard to reform a system that is so corrupted. And if you look back at how we even got a police force, one of the ways in which the police began was by being patty rollers, folks who would go after escaped enslaved persons and find them and bring them back to enslavement or kill them outright. And that the first police department or organized system was in Boston, and they were organized to make sure that the laborers on the docks were kept in order, were kept to task, and that the owners of the shipyard, the owners of the vessels created this police force in order to enforce order. So that to me is something that has to be reckoned with. And that's what Juneteenth offers us, a time to sit back, to intentionally reckon with what do we mean by freedom. I also note that in that year of freedom, Shaw University was founded in 1865. The reminder through the university, our historically Black colleges and universities across the Southeast primarily, and our Rosenwald schools, that folks knew they needed to be educated. Black people knew they needed to be educated in order to take advantage of all that was being offered in this society, in this reconstructed society. And so there is not this passive acceptance of freedom. And that, if anything you hear from me today, freedom was not a passive activity for those who were formerly enslaved. They were active in making their freedom work for them however they could. And so this agency is important to understand as we consider what Freedom Day is all about. I wanted to point out that there are places, there are references that you can go to, and I'm leaving this the PowerPoint with you all so that you can reflect on it a little bit. These are not all the resources, but there are some of them that point to what Juneteenth has meant. And I want to thank you for this first part of the presentation. I'm framing out what we mean by Juneteenth in pictures, but I want to turn now to a little bit of the questions that were asked as I continue my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see folks. So this is framing a discussion. So I know that there were questions that came in the chat, and I will get to some other aspects of what we mean by Juneteenth as we just have further discussion.
Okay, so Dr. Johnson, the first question that came through was, with party politics being as divided as it is, what do we need to do to change the direction of this nation when it comes to racial inequality?
Okay, so the easier answer is being able to elect the persons who are willing to bring social equity. And this is more difficult than just saying it, that each and every time we make movements, so Juneteenth is in conversation with Reconstruction, which was the moment that we should have been able to bring our country together in a way that made sense for everyone. And not just made sense, but that laid the foundation for equality. Instead, there was active resistance against the empowerment of African peoples, of Black folks. And so when that happened and folks were not called, weren't, I would say, held responsible for their actions. And in this, I'm thinking about Wilmington, 1898. How is there going to be a coup and that nothing happens? That there was a reluctance by the federal troops, by order of the federal government, to come into the states. And we are still contending with the divide between what the federal government is capable of doing with our representatives and what states assert as their right. And we are still fighting the Civil War. And I've come to that realization that if we can have the resurgence of white supremacy in the way that it has been apparent, if those young people who were engaged in protests through Black Lives Matter were considered insurrectionists and told that, and were really clamped down hard upon when they were protesting. And then the way we're back, the Senate and House are backtracking, some of the Senate, I should say, half of the Senate, and a portion of the House are saying that those were not insurrectionists. Those were people on January 6th, when folks stormed the Capitol, that was an insurrection, that was an assertion of their right to protest, their First Amendment rights, and that is not accorded to the young people who are asserting their right to protest through Black Lives Matter, then we have a major disconnect.
Mhm.
So to get back to the question, this is the hard work of making democracy live. That we've had the easier thing of declaring freedom days, but the harder thing is actually making freedom work. How do we do that? What is it that we have? How do we empower ourselves to make sure this happens? And part of the thing that does this is a forum like this to have a conversation. And we have really got to get some energy around telling the historical truth in our school system, school systems across the country. We don't have a national dialogue that squares our history in ways that are productive. And Texas is like the textbook example of what happens when you have folks who do not want to put truth into our system, in our education system. So we keep perpetuating the lies that keep us divided. So that's my kind of long-winded explanation of what I see is happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. The next question that we have is from someone who said they would like to learn more about ways for people who are not connected with Shaw to be involved with the mission of Shaw's Center for Racial and Social Justice.
Oh, and that's an easier one. As co-director, and the other director is Dean Johnny Hill, we've created programming internally as well as bringing folks, opening up the different programs to people, any of you, to come and participate. I mean, we have a calendar that we will be putting together that will be open to everyone. But it's not just attending the programs. We're also open to suggestions from the community. What do you want to talk about? How do you want to frame actions? How do you want to get involved with our young people? And so I'm open, and I'll put into the chat my email address. I'm open to folks saying, look, I have an idea. What do you think is this something that of interest? Or how can we work with the Center for Racial and Social Justice? I think that ROAR is a great avenue for having collaborative programming, because you're modeling how we need to go forward in terms of racial equity. And so we would be happy to partner with you all to push it out further than just in Raleigh, but internationally. So I'm going to do that right now in the chat so that I can open it up to whoever would like to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. And I hope that when you send that out, everyone will get that. We are having our usual tech guru is not with us today, and Melvin is doing a great job helping with all of this. So we're working to manage the chat and make sure that people are able to access Betty and me for questions, and that when you send information out, Dr. Johnson, that it'll be available to everyone. The next question that we have is, why do we want to celebrate Juneteenth instead of Emancipation Day?
Okay, so my less cynical answer to that question is because it was this I keep calling it celebration, but it's really more a commemoration that Juneteenth Freedom Day kind of took off across the country, as I mentioned earlier. And because of that, because Black communities in various areas were celebrating it, I think that it captured the imagination of many peoples. Now, the cynical part of me knows that it's also easily made commercial. And that is something that we need to intentionally work against. You know what's going to happen. Same thing happened with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s day. And someone recently was telling me, yeah, it was the day, it's now become the mattress sale day. We have to be the ones to say, no, this is not what this day is about. This day is about, and I'm talking about Juneteenth in particular, the promise of freedom being actualized, and we taking it upon ourselves, our responsibility to make freedom work, freedom in terms of intellectual freedom, also economic freedom, the freedom to be healthy, the freedom from places that are toxic to us. We can do all of that work. We have to keep pushing for the voting rights, and that so that we can set the stage for being able to get into place the people that we need who will really speak for us, and not allow a small fragment, a small portion of our country really dictate what's happening with all the rest of us. And that's like a whole nother kind of discussion. So while I am in some ways ambivalent about Juneteenth, and I call it a bittersweet day, I think that it's important to know that it's also a call to action. And it's something that it is a federal law now. So let us make it be the thing that we need it to be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. That's a powerful way to look at this. Thank you so much. The next question that was sent to us in advance was, how do we leverage the federal holiday designation to get the accurate information about history? Do you have any information on how one can find out information about Black, Indigenous tribes, Native Americans?
Okay. So aside from the scholarship that exists, and so a lot of this is buried in the academy and somewhat inaccessible unless you are willing to penetrate what's going on at our various colleges and universities. So one responsibility that we have, and this would be something we could do through the Center for Racial and Social Justice, is to have programming that helps K-12 teachers infuse, despite the limitations, there are ways to infuse this history into the school, into your lesson plans. Partly you can do it just through saying, looking at a biography. So we have materials also at the state library system. And I would say, let your tax dollars work. Contact state library. Now we have NCpedia, which is a good beginning. That's an online encyclopedia resource about North Carolina. It is only a start. It does not have the full story. So part of where you get the full story is at the North Carolina Museum of History. Push them to have the exhibits that talk about our history, and then come. You know, can't just push it, but you have to participate. There are also, in our libraries, there are folks who are now writing children's books that talk about Black and Indigenous people. There are different kinds of ways. I'm just thinking in my mind, taking over curricula in terms of how we're teaching, giving content to teachers. And I know different resources that are available that talk about that Black Indigenous connection, but you also can get it from talking to folks, going to, for example, different events that are held by the persons who you are interested in. I think that what's really the story that is undertold is out west in Western North Carolina. And we've got Black populations that people don't know anything about that have been there several generations. And it's up to us to get that information out. And so that's where the African American Heritage Commission comes in, where we help facilitate those conversations, those discussions. We're part of the National Gullah Geechee Corridor, because folks don't typically know that from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida is the Gullah Geechee Nation. And that we have considerable Gullah Geechee roots right here in North Carolina, and that there was rice cultivation happening here as well. So it's kind of a journey too, and that it can be interesting, but you gotta kind of make it interesting and spark that in young people, to ask questions and not depress them, not say, that's irrelevant. And the other thing is to push back against the folks who are saying critical race theory is not a thing. Because it is. It is a well thought out pedagogy. I've been using it for years, and there's considerable scholarship underneath that. The other person I would look to is A. Leon Higginbotham. He was a federal judge. He just happened to be too old when Thurgood Marshall retired, because he had an incredible legal mind that he tied to the history of the country. And I can put his full name, if you can read anything, because he's easy to read, to understand. No. Yeah. A. Leon Higginbotham, amazing judge and jurist. And he helps us understand our country.
Well, I feel like with every question that comes, we could spend the next hour or day with you, Dr. Johnson, just sort of unpeeling all the layers in each one. So thank you so much for your depth of wisdom and ideas of how to follow up. And filling up our calendars for the next rest of our lives. So thank you so much. Here's a question that you sort of touched on a little bit, and this is coming from a white participant. Is Juneteenth the day to celebrate or mourn or just acknowledge as white allies? It seems like a tremendous symbolic step forward to recognize Juneteenth nationally, but it also commemorates a terrible tragedy of delayed freedom from chattel slavery. How can white allies further an accurate and constructive language around this day?
So, first of all, I would say, I look at it, allies is y'all are more, can be more than allies. I say accomplices, or co-conspirators, because in that it's more active. Allies kind of, I'm with you. Part of it is being very proactive. Juneteenth is for everyone, even though it came out of the Black community recognizing this really difficult truth that freedom was delayed for so long for a group of people. It is also part of a fundamental aspect of the United States, of who we are, and being able to accept that, and that in your own community, families, the people that would not listen to me may listen to you as you explain or talk about why it is you find Juneteenth both a time of mourning, a time of commemoration, and also a time of celebration. And that's what is the good work. That's why I say it's more than being an ally. It is really being able to speak up and speak the truth that, yes, I'm white, but that is less important than saying, I have this knowledge, this information that I have gathered from my interactions with a group of people, with Roar, whoever you're interacting with, and I want to share it with you and share the story, tell the truth, tell that story of what Juneteenth has meant. And then be able to resist those who would say, these are not facts. For example, resisting the legislation that has been put forward that we can't teach about 1619. We can't teach that particular body of material. Now that's patent foolishness. I'm gonna say it right now. And Tom Tillis, how could he vote for Juneteenth and at the same time advocate for something so egregious? And pointing out those contradictions and then holding folks and say, no, you don't get a pass. Yes, we're celebrating Juneteenth, but we also know the other underlying reasons and we don't accept them. So that's in part what I would say are some actions to take.
Thank you so much. This is the last question that we got in advance in the chat. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat. We have 10 minutes left. Dr. Johnson, I don't know if you have extra time that you can give to us, but in the event you do, we can stay after noon and continue answering the questions. The last question that we got in advance was, any suggestions on drawing the connections between an economy built on enslavement and one built on displacement and gentrification by developers and members of City Council?
So this is a continuation of the inequity that exists, that still exists in our country. So yes, you have an economy that was built by stealing the labor from a body of folks and labeling chattel. When that was taken away, there were other ways in which these groups of people were had their labor stolen. So you put in place, for example, sharecropping, which you weren't in. That's what I meant by economic enslavement. you weren't necessarily enslaved by yourself. You were not owned by anyone. So that wasn't the way your labor was stolen. It was stolen by putting you into a bind so that you could not get out of it economically. So you could own yourself, but you couldn't really capitalize on your labor. That was one instance. The displacement that occurred with gentrification, as well as, I mean, this is where you can talk about Native American populations being removed from their places and then put into reservations. Again, disconnecting them from the land, their historical lands, and putting them somewhere else. But that was all a part of being able to concentrate power and commerce into the hands of a few. And so in that way, it is a continuum. And this is what we're disrupting, that continuum of constantly oppressing folks in order to thief their labor, steal the products of their hands. And just to say really quickly, gentrification happened. It doesn't happen just because of the laws that are set forth. Prior to that, we have federal laws that said that created the redlining system that put folks in the worst places in the community, in their respective cities, next to next to industry, in areas that were not well suited for human habitation. So the redlining served to box people, put them geographically in a kind of enslavement. And it was hard to get out of that. And that whole urban removal system, is hard to find any Black community that didn't experience it. Even in San Diego, California, where it was a Black and Latinx community that was displaced. And I know what that was like personally, to have our home taken away and then forced to live elsewhere. So yes, it's all a part of an oppressive system.
Thank you for sharing that. We have a question. The first question that came in the chat is, trying to make sure that I'm getting them in the right order.
I've got it, Cass. If you
Thank you, Betty.
Yeah, this is on a different note. Are there alumni networks at Shaw that companies in the Triangle can contact with for recruitment efforts? So, yeah.
Yes, and we have the National Alumni Association, and the president of that association lives in the area. And so through that association, they connect with alumni all across the country and internationally. So I would say one way to get to the Alumni Association is through institutional advancement. So if you contact me, I can give you exactly who to connect to, but we do have that association, as well as you can tap into the various fraternities and sororities, because many of those folks came from historically Black communities. And I'm not talking about just the Divine Nine. There are several sororities and fraternities, Black sororities and fraternities, where they have this connection and investment in the area, and who could be contacted as well.
Thank
and
you.
there's a listing of those with our institutional advancement at Shaw, but you can find that out at St. Augustine's, as well as you have, I know at least one person who you can contact, Miss Betty Murchison, who can also put you in touch with a network of people.
Yeah, be happy to help with that kind of a hookup.
Yes.
Two questions you've already touched on. I'm going to read them to honor the fact that the participants asked them. And if there's anything you want to add to what you've already given, how do we ensure that school curriculum tell the truth about violence that followed the federal emancipation and not portray this as a happy holiday with superficial messaging? And a similar question would came from a gentleman who said, "Wonderful job, thank you. Can you share the real reason white America is not willing to discuss racial issues, and how do we convince our brothers to understand Black issues and walk a mile in Black persons' shoes?" You've touched a little bit on both of those. If you'd like to elaborate on that, you have the time.
What I can say is, especially for those persons who are parents and have children in the school system, you've got a considerable amount of power in that, so that you can ask the questions like, why are you not infusing this? So there's some individual responsibility, but then there's also responsibility at a statewide level. And so that those of us who have connections and can talk to our Department of Public Instruction and challenge them to make real their promises to educate our children fully. So you say, well, this is how you do so. And that as we discuss and have programming around Juneteenth, we always have to talk about that, the bitterness that occurred, that there wasn't just this unabashed celebration, that it was always one that recognized the difficulties of asserting freedom, that it doesn't come easily. People don't just give it to you. You gotta assert it, take it.
Okay. Let me step in for a second. We are at time. I know there are probably some other questions. I don't want to know the flavor of the room in terms of do we want to try to continue to answer these questions. I welcome people to stay, but these are very, very important questions that are being asked.
And I can stay for as long as you need me to stay.
That's very generous of you. The next question comes from Melvin. He wants to know, how does Juneteenth importance compare to the value of the ratification on December 6, 1865, 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States?
So Juneteenth, again, reminds us of how people have asserted freedom, and that, that it was this process, but that it wasn't complete, it wasn't finished, because you then had a law that had to be ratified. And part of it is just civics education, helping folks to understand these things don't happen just really quickly, that it also took it took that long until December 6th for the representatives that were elected. Whole nother discussion about who was able to vote for those representatives. They weren't representing everybody in their states because everybody could not vote. And so when it was ratified on December 6th, that was another inflection point. So for me, I just see these as different points in the freedom journey, and that you have to have all of these working together. You need to know the whole piece of the story, that you had 1863, January 1, but that wasn't the end of the story. You had January 31st, where the amendment begins its journey and it gets ratified. But also remember that the 13th Amendment is a conditional freedom document. It doesn't it doesn't say we've abolished enslavement in this country, because we have to look at our prison industrial complex to understand how this is still the unfulfilled promise of freedom. So the conditions that were given and the constraints make it so that it was only a partial document of freedom and a partial document that says we won't have slavery. And it reminds me that if we're not watchful, enslavement can come back again. It can expand out again. It's constrained, but it can also expand out. So you're gonna get me talking about fascism. Oh,
And
no
I
speech.
I know you have a lot more you can educate us on, and this has been amazing. And I think I got all of the questions in the chat. Cass, did you have any more before we turn it over to Siobhan or Melvin for closing words?
I just want to thank you all for staying on and for offering these questions. There's some things that you have me thinking about, especially the ones about how do we educate our young people better. I'll be working on that. And I invite you to contact me if you've got ideas so we can work on it together. Because I think it is that important.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And we are so appreciative of the work you're doing at Shaw and with this new center. The center is fairly new. It was established last year. And I know that you're still assembling organizations and people to be a part of it. And Roar, certainly, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that we want to be a part of anybody who's running a center for racial and social justice. So thank you for joining us today. Siobhan?
Thank you.
Siobhan, you're on mute.
I need a shirt that says that. You're on mute. Can you all see that tab that says thank you? Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. We really appreciated you spending time with us today to share about the history and the future implications of the Juneteenth federal holiday and the call to action for not just the Black community, but for everyone. So again, thank you so much. I also want to remind everyone that I will drop in the chat box a link as promised earlier, where you can find information about other Juneteenth commemorations or celebrations today in the local community. So again, if you have not followed us, we are at Twitter, we're at Raleigh_Roar. Also, we have a website that's listed on the screen. And on Facebook, we are Raleigh Organizing Against Racism. Again, thank you, Dr. Johnson, and I will be following up with you as well because I was very inspired by your presentation and all the work that you've done in the community. Now back to Betty.
I agree. This was a morning well spent. I think that that for many of us taking the time to learn about it, I appreciate the fact that we have allies who want to know how to be involved and how to approach this holiday. I see former board member Jenny Spiker there, and I am so pleased to see her and other members of the board. Jamie Elliott is here, and I'm sorry if I'm leaving anybody out. I'll let Melvin do that, wrap that piece up. But we're very pleased that you chose us to be the place that you would share your knowledge and wisdom with today and start the conversation that we need to have. Melvin, closing words?
Well, you organizers did a great job. Not a lot to say. I know that Siobhan put in the link in the chat, a link to other events that are going on. I encourage you to share and participate in at least one other. But again, thank you for being here, and we welcome and invite you to attend our next community forum. Yeah.
Have a great